Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining in. We will be recording today's webinar, so for anyone who can't make it live today or wants to watch it again, we'll have that on a recording on the webinar page of Grow Ahead's website. So we're going to be hearing some short presentations from both Grow Ahead and the Million Hazelnuts campaign, and ending with a little bit of a question and answer. So as we go along, if a question pops up, just put it in the chat, and then about the last 10 minutes, we're going to circle back and answer them at the end. So I'm just going to give a little bit of background on a few of the overarching topics that we're going to touch on today. So as many of us know, deforestation for agriculture expansion causes about 15 to 18% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And so in the webinar, we're going to hear from two agroforestry and regenerative organic projects that are working both domestically here with the Million Hazelnuts campaign and internationally with the Grow Ahead's agroforestry campaign. So I'm just going to, let's just kick it off and send it over to Ryan. So Ryan is from Grow Ahead. He is the director of Grow Ahead and also works as the organic and fair trade coordinator for Dr. Bronner's. So he's worked in the food and farm justice movement at home and abroad for 20 years, really devoting his time and energy to fair international supply chains, farmer trainings, and investing in organic regenerative agricultural systems. So I'll send it over to Ryan. You can start talking about Grow Ahead's agroforestry campaign.
Awesome. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Julia. I just want to make sure we recognize and introduce Julia as well. Julia is our program manager, at Grow Ahead. And thank you for herding the cats and promoting this webinar. And I'm really excited to be able to share the stage with the Million Hazelnuts program and to hear a little bit more about what they do. So I just want to start things off with a short introduction about Grow Ahead. Grow Ahead was launched in 2017, in large part at the petition of small producer organizations, really throughout the world. One of our partner organizations, Fair World Project, conducted a survey with fair trade producer networks throughout Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And what we found was, in large part, climate change was having a disproportionate impact in their communities, threatening not only their livelihoods, and in many cases, forcing them to suffer from like crop loss and those types of things. But quite frankly, there just wasn't a whole lot of funding available to make some of their projects that they have in place kind of come to fruition. So Grow Ahead was launched to be able to basically connect consumers and activists in the global north, and particularly the United States, with projects on the ground throughout the world. And really our focus is primarily on small scale producers and the projects that they are promoting, in large part because we see industrial agriculture as one of the main culprits behind not only food insecurity worldwide, but also greenhouse gas emissions across the planet. And really, this is backed up by a fair amount of data. Some of you may have read this fantastic book that was edited by Paul Hawken. But when looking at some of both the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases and some of the potential solutions for both reduction in emissions as well as carbon sequestration, agriculture, basically in sort of the natural world really play a really prominent role. So our goal at Grow Ahead is really to accompany and support small-scale farmers all across the world and to harness many of the projects and initiatives that they are developing themselves to be able to expand out that traditional knowledge to a way that's a bigger impact across the globe. And we really see regenerative agriculture really spearheaded by small farmers as one of the best ways to do this. And from our perspective, we really see a number of pathways to what we would call a regenerative future. Certainly training on the ground is really critical as farmers look to utilize and implement some of these regenerative organic practices. Obviously, they need funding to be able to do this in many cases, not only to gather farmers together for these types of trainings, for example, but also to implement programs that, quite frankly, require funding. In many cases, would be otherwise unable to get locally within their countries of origin or through some of the international developed organizations. And of course, we need to continue to work with educating consumers and improve sort of the demand for really regenerative production. So the way we do this at Grow Ahead is through a number of different avenues. One, what we have found is that farmer-to-farmer training is really kind of the most bang for your buck in terms of scaling out regenerative or agroecological practices. This movement emerged from Central America in the 1970s and has had a huge impact with small-scale and peasant farming organizations across the world. So we do a number of programs where we support those gatherings. And then we also have a revolving loan program that provides microcredits to farmers as they look to diversify beyond sort of their kind of cash crop economy. And currently we're doing this with a program in Chiapas, Mexico, as coffee farmers look to get off the roller coaster of the marketplace and diversify into things like honeybee production. And then we also do a number of scholarships, primarily focusing on women farmers, as we see that they are an underserved sector, particularly in the rural and farming communities. And lastly, we've noticed that agroforestry is both a sort of, I would hesitate to say it, silver bullet in the world of regenerative agriculture, but it really addresses a number of the main concerns that we have and challenges facing rural communities, whether it's employment, fair prices, food security, and climate adaptation. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the programs and focus that we've had, particularly within agroforestry. And mainly, it might be worthwhile just to kind of get through some definitions to talk a little bit so we can have sort of a point of reference. While there's a number of different sort of definitions and formats for agroforestry, in many cases, what we're talking about is a long tradition that rural farmers and pastoralists have used over the years as a means of production. And so in my mind, there's many different definitions, but I look at sort of basically 4 different modes. One is silvopasture, which is the integration of livestock into forest systems. And this is a tradition that goes back many, many thousands of years. I was in the West Bank in Palestine last year and saw that they had sort of experiences with silvopasture that dated back 3,000 to 4,000 years. And in many cases are still doing so today. Another sort of component of agroforestry is the use of what's called intercropping. So that's growing maybe annual crops, let's say corn or wheat, for example, with trees, whether those be for timber or shade. That's one other element that farmers have utilized across the world to basically get the most out of their land while basically practicing regenerative practices. And then on the bottom right, where we see a lot of potential, and this is something that Paul Hawken has noted as well, is the use of trees in permanent or perennial agriculture for producing starchy crops to replace those crops like corn and soy, for example, which really have kind of a really negative impact when they're grown in monocultures. And then lastly, what we'll talk a little bit more today, which is the use of multi-strata agroforestry. And that is a kind of a tradition that really emerged possibly out of Polynesia, some 10,000 years ago, where farmers really began to integrate crops, both for food, for fodder for their animals, even medicinal crops, firewood, etc., and a system that really took advantage of both the ecological niches for each of these crops, but was also done in a way that farmers were able to basically grow their production on sort of a minimal amount of land. So looking at multi-strata agroforestry is something that we've been working on with producer organizations, primarily with 2 kind of keystone or cornerstone crops, and that's coffee and cocoa, in large part because those crops form part of a larger ecosystem that really benefit from working in symbiosis with a number of other crops. So just to kind of give you an idea of how this looks in practice, it's basically taking sort of this traditional knowledge that we've seen around the world and really optimizing it for a more commercial application. And this is in large part because what we've seen with farmers in the United States as well as around the world, the average age of farmers these days is in and around 60 years old. And so young people are just not continuing to farm in large part because of unfair prices, a lot of volatility in the marketplace, and quite frankly, farming is really tough work. And so part of the work that is being done now is to really optimize this agroforestry system for commercial production, which would allow farmers to sort of reduce their maintenance costs and potentially reduce their costs of implementation, while at the same time being much more resilient to things like climate change and really the volatility in the marketplace. So when you develop a new agroforestry system, it allows for you to do a little bit more planning in terms of the crops that you want, both for the marketplace, but also for your home and your community, while at the same time being able to grow crops that you may not necessarily consider to be all that common or important. Sometimes maybe it's firewood, crops that produce biomass, for example, so that you don't have to buy inputs like fertilizers. And that allows you to be a little bit more stable in your local community. So Grow Ahead partnered with a established fair trade cocoa and coffee cooperative in the highlands of Peru, Norandino. And what we did was create a fundraising campaign that really took advantage of the different actors in the marketplace. So one, Grow Ahead was able to raise money online to be able to support this program, which was really targeting the planting of almost 200,000 seedlings within their grower groups within the highlands of Peru. And the point is to be able to recreate an agroforestry system that would allow producers to really push back against some of the pressures of climate change. So one of the things that we've seen, particularly in Latin America, with the few degrees change in the climate, that really creates the conditions for the widespread infestation of pest and disease. And so many of you might have heard about La Roya or coffee rust. And this is something that's been affecting producers up and down Latin America. And one of the things that producers have identified, in addition to other approaches, is to sort of recreate this sort of agroforestry system in a way that keeps temperatures cool, reduces pest and disease pressure, but really puts coffee back into a agro-system that really sort of where it's supposed to belong. And it moves away from these types of monoculture type levels of production. So what Grow Ahead did was work together with our partners, primarily with the coffee importing roasters, especially those with the cooperative coffees, which is a great consortia of importers and roasters in North America that have a real strong focus on fair trade. And what we did was take care of a number of different campaigns working with National Association, online donations, as well as contributions from the roasters themselves to be able to launch an agroforestry program in Peru that really focused on a number of things. One, to be able to actually get these seedlings out into the field and to replant at a relatively large scale. Obviously, you need a fair amount of infrastructure. So we developed things like nursery production so that there's actual infrastructure to be able to put this in place. The creation of facilities for compost, for example, which it provides a really fantastic natural nutrients to be able to bring back to the farm. And then obviously another aspect that's really important is training. You know, one of the things that we've noticed in sort of the long experience of international development, there's been just a number of cases where people have dumped money on projects, but without sort of like these key elements in place, everything from training and infrastructure and support and accompaniment. In many cases, the projects have failed. So one of the things that we have noticed that's really critical is working with strong and established local partners to be able to launch these programs with the eye on them being really pollinators. We want to be able to expand these projects out from a one-time thing and really focus on building up that local capacity so that those projects continue on once the funding would be completed. So this just gives you a little bit of an overview of what we've done with our agroforestry project in Peru. And what we're doing right now is continuing to develop out our replanting program with other producer organizations in Peru and other places to be able to kickstart these replanting programs, because we see that agroforestry in conjunction with established, in particular fair trade producer cooperatives, is really one of the best ways to really reinforce food security, stabilize the rural economy, and then allow for farmers to also diversify as well. So I don't want to take up too much time, but agroforestry really is kind of, I would say, as far as, approaches, it's one of the sort of most tried and true ways to be able to address a number of challenges that are facing rural communities, but it's also not without its challenges. So establishing agroforestry plots, especially in degraded land, can be relatively expensive for producer organizations, and it requires a fair amount of sort of support along the way. But really, I think this is one of the great ways that we can focus on collaboration and that many actors can actually get involved. And I think our approach of getting both, buyers like cooperative coffees, retailers, and like National Roasters Association, and then individuals and activists are one way to actually have a really tangible impact on the lives of farmers and really diversify their income. So without actually going to any deeper discussion about this, I want to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion and don't take up too much time from our friends. I wanted to say, if you'd like to find more about this program and others, please visit our website, growahead.org, or follow us on social media. And then, yeah, without further ado, I just want to make sure we've got time for everybody else. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ryan. So next, we're going to have Reginaldo speak a little bit about the Million Hazelnut campaign. So beginning his work on economic development projects with indigenous Guatemalan communities, Regi continued his work the last 30 plus years, mainly working with and founding much of the fair trade movement and organizations, both internationally and here in the United States. So his work in food and agriculture has gained a good amount of national and international attention, as he is the principal architect of the poultry-centered regenerative agroforestry system, which is at the center of many national and international initiatives, including the one he's going to talk about today, which is the Million Hazelnuts campaign. So I'll let you take it from there.
Thank you. I will be sharing this space with Chris Gamer, who's just down the road from me. And just first of all, I'm just going to take a few minutes and then give you a layout of how we came about this campaign. Basically, through the Regenerative Agriculture Alliance, we have moved beyond some of the prototyping, research and development that we did as part of the Main Street project as we developed this what is called the poultry-centered regenerative agriculture model, more under the alliance as an industry. We're calling it really just regenerative poultry. But the foundation of that regenerative design in the case of poultry is the hazelnut. So one of the things we found out early on is that in order for us to be true to our origins, one, our indigenous origins, but also to all of that ancient knowledge that Ryan was talking about, we have to look at the world from the perspective of whether it's animals or plants or microbes even. I mean, they got their own functions and they give us quite a lot of benefits. And when we went back into looking at how we were going to restore the poultry to its original habitat, the first thing we learned was that poultry is simply a jungle animal. It doesn't behave well or doesn't like open spaces. It needs the cover. It needs the protection. And also its food comes mostly because it evolved over geoevolutionary time. It evolved into this being part of this understory. Now, in the United States and in other parts of the world where hazelnuts are native, and by the way, hazelnuts have been adapting for thousands of years to most of the world. You can find them in the ditches in Belgium or Germany or up in Hazelton in British Columbia or 2/3 of the continental US. So in the US, to build this canopy or these jungle-like conditions, we picked the hazelnut and the elderberries as the understory foundation, and then the forages that grow in between the rows or under that canopy as the foundation for the poultry habitat. So the hazelnut then became critical, and as we started to explore how we were going to make this poultry system thrive, and in this photo you can see the hazelnuts on the left and the elderberries on the right. We planted these demonstration sites to show how agroforestry was really central to deploying a regenerative poultry system, not only in the US, but in many other countries. I mean, in Guatemala, we're using a multi-story system with different species. Hazelnuts, of course, we're not using them in the northern rainforest where they don't belong. So here in the US, the idea of launching a hazelnut campaign comes primarily because of the fact that establishing the perennial cropping systems is very expensive. It's an upfront cost of around $7 for the hazelnuts. And we need to bring the public to play with us in terms of building this infrastructure so we can restore the landscape, restore the water capacity, cleaning capacity, the carbon sequestration capacity, and more importantly, reinvent an industry that is really ripe for change, because poultry is one of the most polluting, extractive, and devastating parts of the industrial system, and is one of the most exploitative of people. And it's just it's just a disaster the way it's operating right now. And this is a beautiful way and gracious way of rebuilding that industry while rebuilding the landscape. So the first thing we did was figure that out, how we're going to help the farmers get those perennial crops back in the land so we can restore that ecology so that we can then grow poultry the way it was supposed to be. And at this point, we started selecting and reproducing some of the best breeds, varieties that we have. And this is one way we're doing it, is bringing the poultry manure back, mixing it with wood chips, and then putting some of the selected plants and seeds in the an understory that we have been building with corn and sunflowers to provide that little bit of shade for the hazelnut to then germinate. We're getting really high levels of germination this way. And from here, I'll just let Chris take it on from here, as he has been overseeing the actual deployment of the campaign itself.
Thank you very much for that, Ray. And I want to say thank you, Ryan, for all of the work you're doing with the coffee and the cocoa. I love both of those things and have no idea what my life would be like without them. So thank you for that. And thank you again, Ray, for being the leader that you are. I met you about 20 years ago and I've been really impressed this whole time. So basically, thanks for covering the basics of it and how the hazelnut really is the pioneer plant for poultry-centered regenerative agriculture. And what that's about is stacking functions. I don't know if people have heard about permaculture, but with this one simple transition, if we move hazelnuts onto a landscape that's currently growing soybeans, we just completely transform that landscape. We're protecting the water, we're protecting the soil, we're rebuilding the soil, we're creating local food security, we're delivering a higher quality food from a perennial system. It's just amazing, actually. So, what the Hazelnut Campaign is, it's an initiative that seeks to unite farmers and environmentally conscious citizens in creating a new perennial food industry while combating climate change, providing hazelnut rootstock to farmers across the Midwest. Big part of this is just having solutions that are accessible to people. A lot of the things that you hear about, go buy a solar array, install a wind turbine, people don't have the capital to do that. This program, the Million Hazelnut Campaign, makes solutions, carbon sequestration solutions, accessible to everybody with $7. You make a $7 contribution to the Million Hazelnut Campaign, and what happens is we enter a seedling into a breeding program and get it planted out in a broadacre permaculture setting. The farmer that owns that land gets his initial broadacre permaculture consult as a part of this program so that we can identify other ideas that might work for the farmer to move them forward. So that $7 goes a long way. That hazelnut that you sponsored and creating space for life to thrive for the next 35 to 50 years easily, okay? One of the things that's really important to me is the soil health principles. People really don't realize that the carbon that's in our atmosphere has been released from our soils by tilling over and over and over again, and by all of the energy inputs that are needed to do that tilling. So as part of my work with the SFA, I learned about soil health principles, and it's basically you keep the soil covered, you minimize soil disturbances, you increase plant diversity, keep a living root in the soil, and integrate livestock. So the Million Hazelnut Campaign covers the first 4 of those automatically. And so then the carbon that is in the air gets converted into the living biomass that's in the ground. The most amazing thing to me about the situation that we're in is that for us to get out of it, what we have to do is create a space for life to thrive. All that life is a carbon-based life form. What we're doing is sequestering carbon by creating space for life with the Million Hazelnut Campaign. And that's such a simple and beautiful solution that I really want to share that message with people. All we have to do is get out of the way and let life thrive. The other thing about this is about that initial consult. There's a lot of different ways to implement this farming practice on your land. It doesn't have to be a big monocrop. You can use it in a silver pasture mix. You can use it in alley crops. That's what we're doing here at Regeneration Farms. It's another thing I'd like to mention is that I actually work at Regeneration Farms doing poultry-centered regenerative agriculture, and I'm not exploited, which is the industry standard, and our animals are happy, and it's fun watching them roam around, especially when the hazelnuts get more mature. They just get really active and they're happy there. But anyway, so alley crops, that's what I'm used to. Buffer strips, I've seen a bunch of those, and they do a really good job at protecting our groundwater or protecting from wind erosion. It depends on your site, right? Windbreaks do the same thing as a buffer strip, but you're protecting the soil from the wind instead of the water runoff. It's also a perennial substitute to soybean production, and that's 81 million acres in North America, here just in the Midwest, 12 states, right? All of that land is outgassing carbon, and it doesn't have to. We could meet the same food, fuel, and fiber demands that we're meeting with soybeans using the hazelnut. I think that's a really important choice to make. The thing is, it's expensive. If you're going to convert an acre of land to perennials, you're talking about $3,000 to $7,000 an acre just for the initial install, and then you don't have any income while that plant matures. So asking people to make this contribution to ease that stress on the farmers who are already financially stressed from the situation that we're in would really help push this conversion along. Why hazelnuts? Because they taste great. It's better than a soybean. It just is. They're delicious, in demand, and versatile. The world demand for hazelnuts hasn't ever really been met. It's candy. Everybody wants it. And then there's other useful products you can do with it too. Cooking oils, cosmetics. It would be great to have it in soaps. Yeah. Our goal is to create a market-based response to climate change by increasing access to hazelnut nursery stock for farmers across the Midwest to be able to transition into a perennial future. So there's 81 million acres of soybean production out there that needs to be replaced with something perennial. Right now, we do not have the nursery capacity to meet that load. And what the Million Hazelnut campaign is doing is supporting nurserymen by helping them cover their upfront cost of expanding their production by paying for the plant at the time the seed is planted rather than at the time it's harvested from the nursery. That makes a big, it's just about problem solving so that we can get this moving forward. And that $7 contribution can do it. I have a short video. I don't know if we have time to watch it. What do you think, Julia?
I mean, if it's like less than a minute or two, we can watch it. If it's like a 5-minute video, maybe not so much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not so much then.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess that's what I'm doing, what we're up to. And I'm ready for questions or other comments from other participants.
Well, if we want to watch the video now then, since we do have a minute. I just didn't know how much longer your slides were.
Okay, no, that's the end slide.
Great.
4 minutes and 8 seconds.
Every ecology has its own blueprint, its own natural expressions, and interactions that take place in endless ways here on planet Earth. When you picture a place like the Midwest, you might envision rivers, lakes, and prairies. Or you may think of the grain belt, the homestead, the place where the farmers live. Well, actually, it's a lot more diverse than that, and diversity is what we are striving for. However, the diversity we depend on for survival is being threatened. The majority of farms in the Midwest have been perpetually driven toward crops like corn and soy for decades by industry influence, economics, banks, and federal policies. Farmers have fewer options and are trapped in this system. The crops they grow are dependent on synthetic inputs and tillage, which is eroding our soils and polluting our waterways. We think of this region as the backbone of America. We are proud to be farmers, but this system is causing the eradication of biodiversity, the erosion of topsoil, is deforesting our land, and contributing to nearly 30% of global carbon emissions, more than from any other source. Our solution, the Million Hazelnut Campaign, the reforestation of the Midwest, and it starts with the hazelnut. But before we get into that, let's dig deeper into the problem. We know that 1/3 of the cost of agriculture is energy. Energy in the form of fertilizers, pesticides, machinery, oil, packaging, water, and of course, our own energy. You might wonder, how much of this is actually necessary? Well, it turns out this system is wasting a lot of energy. Consider this. The average farmer in the Midwest is using 40% of the agricultural landscape to grow feed for animals. Animals raised in confinement, being fed grains not even meant for their consumption. Grains grown at such a large scale that the only solution for management is using chemical inputs. These fertilizers, pesticides, and the processing and shipping alone is creating a huge waste stream, while the solution is right at our feet. So what can we do? How do we begin to shift such a deeply embedded system? How can we return our farmland to a more natural state? Can we create an agricultural system that decreases the need for fossil fuel-based energy and transfers that value to restoring the ecology, the economy, and empowers farmers to take control of their future and the future of our planet? The answer to all of these questions is within our reach. And by integrating perennial systems into our farms, we can put carbon back in the soil, provide habitat for wildlife, produce food, prevent soil erosion, and begin the creation of a regenerative future. One of the most promising sectors for reversing these trends is called agroforestry. With agroforestry, farmers can integrate annual crops like grains and vegetables in alignment with perennial trees and shrubs. The hazelnut is not only native to the Midwest landscape and has been used as ancient foods, but also works in perfect symbiosis with annual cropping systems and animal integration. This makes it easier for farmers to afford and scale up, and can put carbon back in the soil, provide habitat for wildlife, produce food, prevent soil erosion, and begin the creation of a regenerative future. We are planting thousands of trees and shrubs, but we are destined for millions. The future is perennial, and farms look a lot like a thriving forest, with the capacity to produce enough food, fuel, fiber, timber, and wealth for generations to come. Join our Million Hazelnut campaign and help us get started down the road to regeneration. Just by giving $7, you will take a hazelnut from seed to farm. We will assure that 1 million hazelnuts get planted on farms across the Midwest. Imagine how many more millions will be planted from there. Imagine a regenerative future.
So there was that. I'd like to give a little bit of a report if we have a few seconds here. So we received funding. We launched on March 9th, received funding for about 1,300 plants and managed to get 10,000 roots in the ground this year. I'm really proud of that. And it's just about collaborative efforts between farmers and nurserymen and the Million Hazelnut campaign.
Thank you so much for sharing.
So,
I think that we're all super interested in the work that you guys are doing, especially with the integration of hazelnuts and poultry systems. If anyone has any questions, we can put them in the chat. Until then, I had a question maybe for you, Ryan. So, we have a question here. So this is from Thomas, and he's asking about rootstock knowledge. So I don't know if you guys want to take that and just talk a little bit about maybe if that's involved in your work as well.
My basic knowledge about rootstock comes from planting out hazelnuts from a few different growers that were basically all working along the same genetic improvements. Plants collected around 1910 and continually improved since then. And they've had varying results. The rootstock that we use now is from New Forest Agriculture, and that's the person that we're working with for the most part. And it's because of the results in the field and the plant resiliency, it's resistance to predation and drought and like that. And so there's probably other stuff out there. I just don't know about it yet. And I'm just really happy with that line of plants and continue to use it.
And just to add to that, Julia, the University of Minnesota and the University of Wisconsin and River Falls together have been doing an incredible amount of research on rootstock options. They have a variety, a very long list of varieties. We have planted almost all of the varieties that have been developed in Forest Ag Enterprises, and also the Badger Set Farm in Harmony, Minnesota. There are many others. Rural Advantage, for example, worked for decades on improving the rootstock. So at this point, what we're doing is just, further evaluating the best rootstock, the production, all of that, and then continuing to select those seeds. There is also more lab-based research, stem cells development at the University of Minnesota. And just for the record, we're staying out of genetically manipulating anything or asexual reproduction. We want to give continuity to the amazing geoevolutionary characteristics of the earth that gives us the best products and all of that. And with careful selection of the rootstock that we have, we know that can be done. And a genetically diverse plant, even if it produces a little bit less than a manipulated plant, is still better for the ecology, for our health, and for the health of the planet. That's what we are right now. And there is an abundance set of options for rootstock at this moment. And so we don't have to worry about that anymore.
Great.
Yeah, so I'll just add, at least in the case of Norandino and their work, they've been focusing primarily on a variety of coffee tree that seems to be pretty resistant to coffee rust. And so that has been done over the course of the last maybe about 10 years ago. There's been a fair amount of research into those varieties that seem to be not only well adjusted to the local climate and soil conditions, but also resistant to rust. I think, from our perspective and in the experience in some of these systems, is that the selection of the right rootstock is pretty critical, and then matching that up with the different crops that are either in rotation or part of the perennial system as well. So at the onset, it can be relatively complex, but once the pieces are in place, it generally is, an established pretty, resilient system.
Great. Thank you for everyone's really complete and awesome answers for that. I had a question that maybe you could talk about a little bit, Ryan. So I'm interested in, we heard a lot about the hazelnut and kind of its being the ideal perennial plant here in the Midwest. Have you seen in some of your work in other locations in other countries kind of like a similar system of having one plant that's really like the best perennial plant for agroforestry systems in the area, or does it kind of vary a little bit more? I don't know if you could elaborate on that.
Well, in general, what our approach has been is to do a bit of a local diagnostic, and that is done on two levels. One is working sort of, and understanding the local landscape to see what grows best in that area, especially as you are in the tropics and you deal with different levels of elevation and soil types. It's important to kind of understand what really grows best there. But I think maybe particularly more important is your work with local farmers and understanding what they want to grow, what they like to eat, what the local market can absorb, and then finally what they would like to sell outside of their community. And so in that particular case, what we've seen is in general, there's usually a mix when designing a multi-strata agroforestry system that really focuses on a couple of things. One, to make sure that you have enough native timber and shade species to basically provide that type of coverage for the crops in their different levels or different strata. And then also making sure that you've got enough food species for local consumption. It doesn't make any sense to overplant on something like coffee or cocoa for the external market when in fact that market may at any point drop like it is now, especially in coffee. And then I think the other element that we've seen that is really critical and sometimes overlooked when thinking through replanting programs is really the planting of like biomass species, those types of species that can be used to basically create their own fertility on the land. One of our big goals is to really reduce the dependency that many farmers have in terms of bringing off, fertilizers or even, compost or soil from off-site to be able to sort of fertilize it and build up their soil. So we do everything from, larger trees that can be used for the production of biomass when they're pruned and chopped, to sort of smaller, or low-level crops, things like pigeon peas or other nitrogen fixers, for example, that can actually feed the soil, especially during that transition period. I think really the biggest challenge for many farmers is that transition period from planting for the first couple of years until many of the crops in that system can actually become mature enough to be able to provide income or provide food. So making sure that there is both production for consumption, but also you're building up the soil by planting crops, especially nitrogen fixers.
Great, thank you so much. Definitely very interesting, especially with the work like Grow Ahead, working in so many different communities and different contexts, is really finding what's the best combination for the local farmers and communities. So if there's no other questions, I think that we can wrap that up. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in and really engaging. I'm excited to continue this conversation. And so the webinar will be available via our webinar page on the Grow Ahead website. I'm also going to send out a link to everyone. So if anyone wants to share it, they're able to. And then you can follow along with both Grow Ahead and the Million Hazelnuts campaign on social media and contribute to both of those agroforestry campaigns and programs. So thank you guys so much for coming in, and thank you to all of our panelists, Ryan, Reginaldo, and Chris. It was really awesome to be able to share our knowledge and really talk about what these campaigns are looking like. So thank you.